With the outbreak of World War I in mid-1914, the need for the Allies to transport goods and people across the Atlantic became extreme. 10 days into the war, President Woodrow Wilson created two new government entities, the Emergency Fleet Corporation and the United States Shipping Board. Their task was to oversee the job of harnessing American industry for the war effort. These agencies quickly took charge of private American shipyards and steel mills and began organizing the first mass production of ships in history. Along the saltwater coasts, the shipyards focused on huge battleships and large cargo liners. The shipyards on the Great Lakes, however, were landlocked. In this era, access to the lakes from the ocean waters was restricted by the Welland Canal and the St. Lawrence River and their system of small locks. Those locks had the capability to handle vessels no larger than 270 feet in overall length. However, the needs of the emergency fleet were such that the assets of the shipyards on the Great Lakes needed to be used. Thus, a steamship that could be quickly mass-produced on the lakes and then sail under its own power through the locks of the St. Lawrence to the sea was developed. And this was it. Now, many of you may have seen this sort of lake boat in the history books and know why they were constructed. But you probably may not know the whole story. There are a few very interesting events involving these boats, including the fact that some of these served in 2 world wars, and a few served for the enemy. We'll cover the whole story in detail in this video. Of course, we'll have to start from the start. First off, these boats were commonly known as, quote, Lakers, unquote, because that was the code word that the shipping board used to designate them. However, in the early years of war production, the vessels intended to go directly to Britain were designated with the code word war. Eventually, nearly all of the boats had their christened name prefaced by the word lake, to indicate their origin as having been the Great Lakes and their shipyards. Their design was a model popularized in Fredrikstad, Norway. Each was a 3-island steamer. Uniquely, these vessels had no cabin occupancy below the spar deck. This made them easy to build and, from a wartime point of view, easy to evacuate. They were also canal-sized for transiting the Welland Canal and the St. Lawrence River's locks. Contracts for a total of 346 ships were sent to 14 different shipyards on the lakes. Of course, the Emergency Fleet Board was also ordering scores of assorted vessels from saltwater shipyards along the U.S. coast. This video, however, will focus on those constructed on the Great Lakes. Also keep in mind that only 307 of this type were actually constructed. Let's take a close look at this type of vessel's configuration. Here we see a profile view of a basic World War I Lake-class steamer. Although the hulls were nearly identical, there were variations in rigging and mast locations. We'll begin with the basic overhead layout. Here we have the forecastle deck, which is maritime slur for the forward castle, or so the books say. Next we see the cargo decks and hatches through which the cargo is loaded and unloaded. Then the bridge deck, where the cabins are located. And finally we have the poop deck. Standard for these vessels were 4 hatches. Hatch covers were made of wood and moved by hand. Below the main deck is located the steam engine and boiler. All but 2 of these vessels were equipped with triple expansion steam engines. Engines varied in horsepower from 1250 to 1500, and exact specifications depended on what yard constructed the vessel and what engines were available. Two vessels, the Ada, which later became the Lake Oneida, and the Motor 1, which became the Lake Mohawk, were powered by diesel engines. Boilers were also dependent on what was available locally. Coal fueled the boats and was normally loaded by way of the upper chute as well as the side chutes. Next, let's look at the bridge deck and the cabins in detail. Beginning on the starboard side, we have the officers' cabins. This is the first officer's cabin, third officer's cabin, and the second officer's cabin. Farther aft, we find the engineers' cabins, starting with the third engineer, second engineer, and chief engineer. Notice here that the chief engineer's room is traditionally closest to the most direct access door to the engine room itself. Next, we have the engineer's mess room. Plenty of room on the table with bench seating all around. Interestingly, the engineers not only have their own toilet, but also have a shower. Such was not common among Great Lakes freshwater freighters of that era. Aft we see the room of the three oilers. Notice that there is one bunk bed pair and one single bed. I'd bet that the meanest oiler gets the single bed. Moving forward, we have the room for the two cooks. Keep in mind that even though meals were scheduled, a happy vessel feeds the crew around the clock, so two cooks are needed. Here we have the cabin for the steward. Someone has to set the tables, serve the food, bus the tables, and do the dishes. This room is marked hospital, or some may call it the sick bay. No idea who the medic would be, and there is no cabin for such a person. However, it is a reminder that these were wartime vessels, so casualties had to be considered. Finally, we have the officer's dining room, which is labeled as the, quote, saloon. But I seriously doubt that there were bartenders, piano players, and dancing girls involved. Here we have the heart of any freighter, the galley. Notice here that unlike freshwater freighters of this era, all of the access for cabins on this deck are indoors. This means that to do something such as visit the galley, crew members did not have to go out onto the open deck, unless you were quartered here in the poop deck. First off is the cabin for the 6 able-bodied seamen. Next is the bosun and carpenter's room. Here we see the crew's mess room. Plenty of tables and bench seats. This is the crew's washroom. They also have a shower. At length, there is the cabin for the hardest working men aboard any steamship of this era, the firemen. Of course, these are not the guys who put out fires. This is the black gang, the guys who shovel the coal that keeps the boilers heated, which makes the steam that powers the vessel. It was a never-ending, back-breaking chore. The term black gang comes from the fact that these crewmen always were covered in soot and coal dust. Our final stop on the tour of the poop deck is here, the crew's toilets. I'll add here that these vessels had no sewage system or holding tanks. That said, I'll leave it up to you to decide exactly where the waste from these commodes ended up. Now that said, if you are wondering if the term poop deck had anything to do with this cabin feature, I'll turn you to Patterson's Illustrated Nautical Dictionary, 1891, which states, "A vessel is pooped when a sea breaks over her stern. Pooping is when a sea follows so fast after the vessel as to fall upon her poop or the after part of the ship. It is said to be a pooping sea. Thus, the term poop deck simply means the place where a following sea would break over her stern. Of course, you're free to snicker anyhow. Now we move forward again to the cabin directly above the saloon. This is the captain's personal quarters. As expected, the captain has the largest bed on the vessel. He also has a fine roll-top desk and his own private bathtub, as well as his own toilet and sink. Oddly, however, he too had to venture out onto the open deck in order to reach the galley, just like the poop deck crew. At the crest of everything aboard these ships is the pilot house. This drawing is unique because it depicts pilot house controls. Here we see the engine room telegraph, the engine room speaking tube. Yes, there was no telephone, so voice communication was done by shouting through the tube. There were 2 whistle pulls. And here is the binnacle. Aft, we see the chart room, which has its table and a very nice couch. The United States entered into the war in the first week of April 1917. Shortly thereafter, the Emergency Fleet Board was formed and contracts were sent out to every shipyard. In fact, at least one place on the Great Lakes that didn't have a steel shipyard was given a contract. Saginaw, Michigan was awarded a contract and told to begin making ships. In fact, the new shipyard was not really in the city of Saginaw. The yard was a bit up the Saginaw River on the west side in the community of Carlton. The city of Saginaw had never before built a steel ship. One of the first of this Great Lakes class of seagoing ships was launched at Port Arthur, Ontario. In those early days of the emergency fleet, all of the vessels intended to be given to Great Britain were identified by the name prefix War. So this early vessel was launched in September of 1917 as War Fish. She passed Detroit downbound at 8:30 Sunday night, September 23rd, 1917, with a load of grain. The U.S. joined the effort by launching War Ferret on December 29th. As 1918 began, the Great Lakes shipyards went into full swing. Some tried to set records for the fastest construction. The record for the Great Lakes was just 34 days and was set in Ecorse, Michigan during the construction of the Crawl Keys. Her launch took place just 14 days after her keel was laid on July the 11th. Then 20 days later, she steamed from the yard off to join the war effort. By the time this record was set, the Emergency Fleet Board was in the process of changing all of the names of steamers to begin with the code word lake. Many were renamed on the builder's ways. Yet quite a few, such as Crawl Keys, were missed. As 1918 wore on, every one of the 14 shipyards on the lakes had vessels ready to launch and several waiting to sail off to service. But on November 11th of that year, the war ended. Yet the rush construction of steamers continued for more than a year. Finally, in 1920, the remaining contracts were canceled. A large surplus of these freshwater cargo ships sat simply in the yards, waiting. Of course, many were soon sold to private interests and went on to healthy saltwater careers. The most ironic twist in this story is the fact that many of the Great Lakes-borne steamers would later serve in the next war. Yet more than a few of them would be working for the Japanese. Only 11 of the Lake-class emergency vessels were lost to enemy action during World War I. One, the War Ferret, sailed out of Philadelphia and was simply never heard of again. Most of the Great Lakes emergency fleet vessels met their end because of one man, Henry Ford. In 1925, Ford saw that there was a huge fleet of these boats laid up along the Atlantic coast. Of those, 150 were Lakers. Ford bought them all for what averaged out as a $8,530 per vessel price. He had them towed to the Rouge River, so the majority could be fed as scrap into his blast furnaces. However, he retained a baker's dozen to be converted into barges. One such barge was the Lake Freeland. During World War II, Ford had her lengthened and reconfigured as a steamer, with her original cabin style. Lake Freeland worked the U-boat-infested waters of the Caribbean during the war. On June 25, 1944, her crew rescued 5 Navy airmen on a life raft just 2 hours after they had ditched. For that action, Lake Freeland was awarded a commendation from the Secretary of the Navy. She survived the war and had a long career, serving until April of 1973, when she was scrapped in Argentina as the Navmar. She was perhaps one of the longest surviving active steamers of the Great Lakes Emergency Fleet.